Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. And we're so pleased to have you all joining us today for this talk, Immigrant Jewish Musicians and New York Mutual Aid Society's 1920s to 1960s with Dan Karkner. This talk is a fellowship talk. YIVO has a number of fellowships which we give annually to researchers that are using our collections for their research. And this particular fellowship is the Ruth and Joseph Kremen Memorial Fellowship in East European Arts, Music, and Theater. And we're so pleased to have Dan Karkner here with us this season, doing the research that he's done in our collections and presenting it for us and for the public. Dan Karkner is a historian and library technician from Vancouver, Canada. He has a BA in history from the Simon Fraser University and an MA in history from the University of British Columbia. His current research interests relate to immigrant klezmer musicians in New York from the 1890s to 1920s, including their biographies and family histories, their professional relationships, and their efforts to copyright their compositions with the U.S. Library of Congress during the interwar years. He was a music editorial board member of the Klezmer Institute's Scholarly Editions Project and is an active volunteer for the Institute's Kisselgoff-Makonovetsky Digital Manuscript Project. He is a member of the board of the Parrott Center for Secular Jewish Culture in Vancouver and works at the Center for Post-Secondary Accessible Resources, British Columbia in Vancouver. So Dan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'll just get my PowerPoint started here. All right. So thanks again to YIVO for giving me this fellowship, which let me come to New York in the last few months and do this research that I've been thinking about for a while now. Um, my main research topic for the last few years, like he said, has been about klezmer musicians, but it's a very difficult topic to research in some ways because they weren't really celebrities who are written about very much. Um, and they live fairly private lives. So this collection at YIVO was very invaluable to me to sort of try to figure out who some of these people were. So I'll start off just with a sort of an explanation of what these mutual aid societies were that I refer to and what's the connection to musicians before getting more specifically into my research. Um, so basically, there were quite a large number of these immigrant Jewish mutual aid societies in New York. I think the earliest seems to be in the 1890s. There's probably a few that were before that. And then in the early 20th century, they just really started picking up steam. So a lot of the ones I looked at were founded around 1905, 1910, or onwards from there. Um, Basically, what I mean by mutual aid society is it's sort of a membership society where you have to pay regular dues, monthly dues, or quarterly, or whatever it may be. And then in exchange for the dues, you get sick pay if you're off work, and you get access to the organization's cemetery for eventual burial. Sometimes you can get free loans or access to other benefits, but those are sort of the basic things that all of them have. Um, and I would definitely say the heyday is sort of from the early 20th century till World War II and maybe into the 1950s. And then as a lot of Jewish people moved out of New York, as the immigrant generation sort of gave way to American-born generations, they definitely lost relevance. And then most of them dissolved legally and sort of took apart all their assets, by the 1990s or early 2000s. Um, for the most part, they were founded on a geographic basis. So people would arrive from a particular place and found in New York sort of a mutual aid society for people from their hometown. But and you can see in Lievo's collection, there's quite a variety of other basis for this type of society. So it could be there's a religious congregation and they sort of spin off a mutual aid society as part of it. Um, it could be based around a trade like musician or bricklayer, different things. Some of More rarely they're about what neighborhood in New York. So, a certain Bronx or Brooklyn area or something might have its own mutual aid society, and so on. Um, they seem to usually have a few dozens to hundreds of members, not really, and not definitely not 1,000 or something as far as I've ever seen, because they often print the lists and it sort of grows and shrinks over the years, obviously. But I think once they gain too many members, it would become impractical. So they would spin off and start another one, with a more reasonable number of members. Um, and you can see in a lot of the documents that a lot of them are considered branches of the workers' circle, Arbeiterring, or later in the 1930s, the International Workers' Order, which was sort of a communist breakaway group, if I understand correctly. And then a lot of them are just independent, sort of legally constituted organizations. You might also hear the term landsmanshaft, and that's basically what YIVO calls most of their collections. And that's most of these mutual aid societies, the ones with a geographic basis. So I might use them somewhat interchangeably in this lecture, but the Landsmannschaft is the one that's for people from a particular place, be it a town or city or region in Eastern Europe, and then their families, maybe and friends who are not from there, perhaps. But like I said, there's others that don't necessarily have a geographic basis, and they function the same way in terms of the benefits and the social calendar and so on. So that's an explanation of that. Um, Sort of how I got on this topic was a few years ago. I was researching this klezmer musician, Abe Ellenkrieg, who was the first person to record a klezmer orchestra in the US in around 1913, I think. So he was a member of a Landsmannschaft called the Zolotonosher Friends. And I don't think he's in this photo, but the woman sitting on the left with the sort of flower on her dress, that's his sister, I believe. So it was sort of them and other people from their hometown in New York. This one was founded in the mid 1920s, if I recall. So this sort of got me interested to think, even if there's no information about what he was doing in this Landsmannschaft, I was thinking, oh, he must have played music for them, and what's the story there, and so on. So that's sort of what got me interested in this. Um, in terms of what YIVO has about these societies, they have quite a lot. Even in 2.5 months, I was unable to get through everything that could possibly contain something about musicians. So it's sort of, even though I didn't, yeah, as I was researching, sometimes there'd be letters inside some of the collections that was from the 1980s, say, saying somebody had written to them and asking, "Oh, can you send us all the materials you have for your organization as it's dissolving?" So as I understand it, that's how YIVO got a lot of them, just by doing an outreach. I don't know when it started, but definitely in the 80s and 90s, a lot of them, the society is dissolving and they're sort of selling off their assets, and then they donate whatever they can find to YIVO. So according to the website, they have about 1,500 societies. I definitely didn't look at that many. Um, and in some cases, what they have for a particular society might be just a folder with, one ticket in it. And other times it could be 10 boxes with, every meeting minutes from 1910 to 1970. It's really varies quite a lot. Um, the most common contents of these collections are the meeting minutes, like I said. So these could be most commonly in English or Yiddish, but sometimes in German, especially in terms of the Galicianer Landsmannschaft, they would often have German meeting minutes. Anniversary journals, which is sort of every 5 years from the founding, they would have a banquet and they would put out a journal. Financial ledgers, cemetery records, other stuff that's a bit more boring. And then, some of them contain all kinds of other things. I saw photographs from Eastern Europe that were sent to the organizations, or letters to their members back and forth, application forms, all kinds of other things. In terms of like what's the connection between this and musicians? So this is, you have to think, obviously in the early 20th century, it's before mass like televised or even radio entertainment. So they, as part of their sort of calendar of these organizations, they had all kinds of entertainment for their members. And so aside from dances and cultural evenings, all kinds of civic balls, masked balls, and so on, they would have every generally in January, when they elected a new leadership, they would have an installation meeting, or an installation banquet, and they would have live music sort of playing as part of that, sort of like a march of the new leadership, things like that. And then there's this sort of 5 year uh, jubileum banquets, or whatever they're called. And as I found when I was looking to the materials, some of these societies sort of had their resident musician who may have been a member or just a friend, or a good quality one that they enjoyed hiring, and they would hire them repeatedly over the years. And finally, there was a mutual aid society specifically for klezmer, mostly klezmer musicians that I won't get into here. The Progressive Musical Benevolent Society. Evo also has a collection about this society, um, but didn't enter into this research too much. So next, I'll get into sort of what my process was of looking through Evo's collections and figuring out what the ties were between musicians and these organizations. So just to give like a broader explanation about what's known about, say, klezmer musicians or immigrant Jewish musicians in New York at that time, just speaking from my perspective as sort of a klezmer music fan, the names that people seem to know is the people who recorded these 78 RPM records. I would say like between when Abel and Krieg did it in 1913 and then sort of the boom after World War One, and then it sort of fizzled out by the time of the Great Depression. So that's sort of the golden age of recordings. And so there's sort of a limited number of band leaders that people know their names well, and then there's probably some others who recorded once or twice. People, if they're really diehard fans, they might know their names, but for the most part, the wider economy, it's not very well understood, I feel, especially given by the time of the revival in the 70s, people who had been active in this much earlier phase were mostly gone, with a few exceptions. So this is why I got interested in these mutual aid society events as sort of a way to find out and sort of figure out the networks of these musicians, where they came from, who they're playing for outside of the recording industry. Um, and I originally got into it through these advertisements, which are very ubiquitous in the back pages of old Yiddish newspapers. So there would be announcements of an upcoming ball or strawberry social, literary night, such and such. And if I'm lucky, they print the name of the musician that's playing for it. So, for example, this one says music by Professor Schiller. So it's quite typical that they would call klezmer musicians professor. So that's the usual format. And but other times these advertisements just say music by Union Orchestra or something else. Or they just don't mention, it says it's a dance, but it doesn't say anything about what the music is. So it's sort of, it can be interesting, but it's a very limited source of information because especially if it's a common name, you can't really say which person it is. So these anniversary journals that YIVO has so many of are really a better source for this type of research. As I said, they're sort of published generally every 5 years at a sort of anniversary banquet of the organization, although there's all kinds of other ones. Sometimes they had a banquet to recognize a member, or they had just an annual ball. Sometimes they would release them just, along with that as well. They're pretty much always printed in Yiddish and English. So starting from one cover and starting from the other cover and sort of meeting at the middle. Um, and they sort of generally follow a certain format, but with some changes here and there. So it's usually what's happened in the last year or 5 years with the organization, usually some kind of history in Yiddish of, how it was founded and who the presidents were in the year since, and then just little poems and greetings and essays and little things from the members. Typically, they would have a list of the members and maybe their addresses at the back, and then at least half of it would be advertisements. So in general, people just who are members of this, who may have, a restaurant or the musicians, and then other times it's people who are maybe outside of this community but just sort of want to support their event and sending them a greeting, with sort of the information about what restaurant they own or whatever. And then just to say, Evo has quite a lot of these. I didn't count exactly, but I would say it's at least in the hundreds. So definitely a rich source of information. So I'll just show a few samples of what I was looking for when I looked through these journals. So the covers vary quite a lot. It's actually a lot of them are really beautiful. They're sort of Art Nouveau or Art Deco or sort of Gothic ones, ranging to hand-drawn images, all kinds of things. So it's really, to me, it's like a very interesting sort of historical thing I never really was exposed to in this way. Sometimes the cover, even says what the venue was and what musician played, but generally maybe the inside cover has more details and would say it's taking place, at the Beethoven Hall and Naftuli Brandvan is playing or such and such. So this one you can see there's a program with sort of the order of events, which not all of them have, maybe half of them. And it says Professor Hollander and Berger's Orchestra. And then if I flip to the advertisement section, I find Samuel Berger, musical director, and then his home address. So this is the most common thing, and they don't always sort of make everything explicit. Sometimes it doesn't have a program, it doesn't say who's playing, but there's just one musician advertisement. So you can think maybe this person played the this particular banquet, probably. And here's just another one that's kind of similar. So this one doesn't have a program in it. Um, but it does have the name of the venue and then it has an advertisement for a musician. So again, I can sort of look over, if I have a few of them, I can look over the years and start saying, okay, this musician has been playing for this one, or this was just a one-off, and the next time it was somebody else. I also noticed when I was in New York that the public library has a large collection of these, which is actually specifically around the anniversary journal. So they have microfilms where it may be one microfilm roll with like thirty journals on that are just all of different unrelated organizations. So that was sort of also another helpful way for me to look at some other ones that Evo doesn't have, although, I realized over time that some of them have some overlap. So here's just an example of one that I got on microfilm at the New York Public Library instead. So I can sort of expand some of my information just by looking at other ones that Evo doesn't happen to have. And then in terms of Evo's collections, there's I mentioned the meeting minutes. Those can be a very rich source where you can see week by week the discussion of which musician they wanting to hire, how they're planning the banquet, and so on. It was sort of done in a very democratic way in terms of planning transparently and so on, but they don't usually say much about why they picked somebody or what they thought of it. They just announcing that they did pick them. But at least it allows me to sort of figure out how these things worked. And yeah, in some of the collection, there's other things which I won't get into that mention the musicians, be it, a ticket that has the name on it or a letter to all members inviting them to come see the concert and so on. So by the end of this, I also didn't count exactly, but I'd say I collected about 100 different names in here. So some of them are people that I consider sort of klezmer celebrities like Dave Terrace or Naftali Brandwein. Some of them I knew from Yiddish theater context like Sholem Sekunda or Abe Elstein or Alexander Olshanetsky. And then almost all of them, I hadn't heard the name or maybe a very obscure klezmer name, from old New York. So this is sort of a good way to collect a lot of different names and start, like I said, figuring out who they are and where they're coming from. I was kind of thinking during the research, like, can I really call them all klezmer musicians? I wasn't fussing too much about the definitions here. To me, it's Jewish immigrant musicians playing these community functions. That was the main thing. So, in a sense, probably a lot of it is what we would call klezmer today. But when they're playing, like when they have the musical program, it's quite often foxtrots and waltzes and American music. So, you know, but klezmer musicians obviously played all kinds of things, but then there's sort of very little information about the musical side of it in terms of Jewish music and Jewish dances and so on. Um, but yeah, suffice to say that pretty much all of the names I came across were Jewish immigrants or in some cases the children of immigrants, but it wasn't a case where they're hiring a lot of, Italian musicians or other, ethnicities. So it's kind of arbitrary, but I was trying to think about some sort of different types of these band leaders. Once I sort of noted down their names and looked up, figuring out who they were and sort of trying to categorize them a little bit. But there's, obviously many exceptions and people who fit into two different categories. So the names that jump out at first is what I call the celebrity ones. So these are names that I already knew, and these were probably considered like a big get for the organization to hire Naftuli Brandwein or whoever to play their function, just because they're on the radio and they're recording, so they're kind of a great high quality musician. But more typically, it's sort of the next two categories. So this kind of small time musician band leader who's a member of the Landsmannschaft is quite typical. And or else something that's kind of similar is maybe somebody who's not a member, but who is also very small time and is born in the same place and, isn't known from the radio or recording or anything. They're just sort of a small time working band leader. And one that interests me is what I kind of call an officer band leader. So it's somebody who is a member, but they're also running to be the president or the founder, such and such, and they're also playing the music. So that's kind of interesting. And then finally, it's one that I call the old timers. It's when I would look up the people playing in the 1920s and realize, oh, this person is born in 1865 or, much earlier, because a lot of them playing in the 1920s or 30s, maybe they're born in the 1890s or the turn of the century. So, you know, I realize in this mix, there's some quite much older people. And even if you look at the musical program, they're playing foxtrots and waltzes and stuff. So they're sort of keeping up with the program. So if you look at the materials, it doesn't look any different. It's only by identifying who they are that I realize they're significantly older. I'll go over some of the types and just some examples that I found. So the celebrity ones, as I mentioned, Naftali Brandwein, Dave Terrace, these sort of people who recorded with Victor Records, Columbia Records, and so on. And it was definitely touted in the program or the advertisement. They would say, such and such and his Columbia Orchestra or his Victor Recording Orchestra, things like that. So they definitely laid it up just as sort of a matter of prestige. And like I said, I think it makes sense if they didn't have a musician or not necessarily a good one in their society, then they would look around for the best one to hire. So and the last thing I'll say about this is that it's kind of hard for us to know who was considered a celebrity back then. So, I'm open to the fact that maybe some of the ones that I'm not recognizing at that time were considered, oh yeah, this is one of the best in town. That's possible. Just hard for me to know um, from here. So, an obvious example of this is Dave Terrace, who is sort of one of the most famous New York klezmer musicians. And he shows up in some of these banquet journals in the 1930s and 40s. So, for example, this Vinitzer one, he was from there, so it makes sense. I don't think he was a member of this, but it makes sense that they would hire him specifically. And the feud that he was playing is generally from his home region or in Bessarabia, which is sort of a neighboring region, and also where he had lived before coming to the US for a little bit. So gives you an idea that there's probably something musical going on here, playing in a certain style from the home region. The ones that I call the small time member band leader, these are ones where they don't really show up anywhere else. I wouldn't have heard of their names, but then once I start looking into the materials, I realize this person was, in a family that was all members of this organization, and they, in some cases, playing for decades for all of the functions, or sometimes only for a few years. But this is quite typical for the things that I found. Um, as it says here, they're often born in the same place, so they've joined the society of people from their hometown or home region, and then they may also be playing for other groups that are for people from that region as well. Something I typically found. So one of the sort of richest examples I found was this guy called Max Taylor or Taylor. I'm not sure how he pronounced it. He occasionally called himself Mac or Max over the years, and um, he was actually born in the U.S. and I couldn't quite figure out who his parents were to say, but I'm sure they're from probably one of these regions that he was, the member of here. So he initially joined a different Landsmannschaft, Stanislauer, and then by the 30s he joined the progressive Horodenker one, which is what Ivo had the collection of. And this was also the singer Ben Bonus's Landsmannschaft, so he shows up in some of the materials. He wasn't playing in their concerts or anything, but he was a member. So yeah, by the time this guy Mac Taylor joined this Landsmanschaft in the late 30s, he started playing all their banquets and functions. And then for quite a long time, like until around 1969, 1970, I would find advertisements or sort of newsletter mentions saying, "Oh yeah, he's playing our ball next month or such and such, or he's playing the wedding of these members and so on." So this particular one is interesting for me just because it shows in much more detail. They're sort of joking around about him in the newsletter, talking about that he played at such an event and so on. So that one was interesting to me. And then one that I know much less about, as another example, this guy Max Elspresser. Um, he was born in Galicia, although I couldn't find anything more specific than that in genealogical records and so on. But he joined this Erste Orbitiner sort of organization, and started playing regularly for them. So aside from for them, he was also playing for this. There was sort of an Obertiner literary club that I found a lot of newspaper advertisements for. So starting maybe 1911, I found some that he was playing for them. And then for this Landsmannschaft, his own Landsmannschaft, he was playing at least into the 1930s. So it's just many examples like this where it's sort of very spotty information, but you can tell, there's some kind of geographical connection here. And this is kind of the adjacent kind where they weren't specifically the member of that organization, but they were from the same region and they sometimes had a sort of a regular relationship with them and probably a couple of organizations of people from that area. So it's hard to count exactly, but yeah, I would say it's likely at least around half of the all the names are someone like this. So um, yeah. So here's one of this types who was playing for a bunch of Landsmannschaften that he wasn't a member of, although he sort of bucks the trend because he was from Vilna or Vilnius, but then he was playing for ones from sort of wide-ranging regions. So, it's not always like a strictly geographic thing, but this is sort of an example of somebody who was not like a big time celebrity, but was playing around for a few different ones. I only found two examples of this, although I'm sure there are more, which is sort of ones that are particularly interesting to me because I was already a fan of these two musicians. So this was Abe Katzman and Berish Katz, who are sort of minor figures from the old klezmer world who people may know some of their recordings from the 1920s. Um, so Abe Katzman uh, played sort of Bessarabian or Keshenever music. So of the two discs he made, basically they're all talking about Keshenev in the title and stuff. And then Berish Katz was in the Boybreaker Capella, which sort of recorded Galician recreation of Galician wedding and so on. So yeah, both of their known sort of recorded output are very closely identified with their sort of hometown style. So it's interesting to me that they're also the officers very active in their Landsmannschaft and so on. So here's a bit more about Berish Katz, who for some reason on the census always called himself Bernard Katz, and in any of these materials he's always Ben Katz. Um, yeah, so like I said, we know him from his 1920s commercial recordings, and then Yivo has some 1940s, I think reel-to-reel recordings made by Ruth Rubin, which are sort of now posted in the Ruth Rubin collection, where you can hear him just by himself playing violin or singing sort of old-fashioned klezmer from Glina. And he comes up in some of the materials of this Glinianer Young Men's Association in the 1940s. He became president, so you can see him on this program um, both as the musical entertainment and then as the vice president. And in other years, just in the meeting minutes, you would see he was elected to other roles or running, but not getting elected, things like that. So he was sort of active in this society at the time. The ones that I called old timers, I wasn't able to find as much about them necessarily, but I personally just find them fascinating as sort of thinking about a longer term history of klezmer from Europe and people with a tie to a much earlier era than we know about from the recording industry, the sort of golden age. So, um, like I said earlier, when you look at the archival materials, nothing seems different about it. It's only sort of in figuring out who they are that it sort of comes across differently. And then when I go back to these advertisements that have very minimal information, sometimes I can start figuring out that, for example, this guy Jacob Marinashore, who shows up in this advertisement, was, playing music into the start of the 20th century when he arrived. So earlier, like Evo doesn't necessarily have like they don't have anniversary journals from those early years, probably because they didn't exist. So um, you can figure out that sort of an earlier connection to an earlier time. So here's a bit more about Jacob Manashor. He was born in Iași, Romania, and came to New York at the turn of the century. And he initially joined a Bucharester landsmanshaft, and then, as far as I can tell, he moved to the first Romanian one in 1919. And but when I search his name, which is obviously a more unique name as well, it shows up in many of these old advertisements for labor unions or different landsmanshaft events. And then in terms of Ivo's collection in the Erste Romaner Landsmannschaft that he became a member of, he sort of became their regular musician um, in the 1920s at least. Just to say a few things that I maybe hoped to find or expected to find and didn't. So first of all, some of the other names from the recording industry. So Abe Ellenkrieg, who I mentioned, Max Libovitz, a lot of these other recording figures who we know from their recordings. I didn't encounter them in any of these sources. I don't know if it's because they weren't playing this kind of thing at all, or it just happens that the ones that were saved and ended up in Evo don't mention them because it's hard to say, but that's definitely something that I was searching for the whole time and didn't find. And then women, these band leaders are 99% men. I think I found one woman, Shirley Barron, who was played for a benefit for an orphanage that she had been an orphan in much earlier. So this was in the 1960s, as I recall, and so she was sort of the one woman band leader that I found. I would guess that the usual sort of 10-man orchestra, there's probably no women either. But if it's sort of more of a literary cultural event banquet where they have different types of things like dancers and comedians and all kinds of things, then women typically did appear. So they may be a violinist accompanied by a piano or a singer, things like that. So definitely a very male dominated thing, this whole world of orchestras, dance orchestras. But again, it's hard to say, definitively because they don't list everything. They only give the name of the band leader. So that's that. Just to go over some of the general observations after I looked at all of these materials, which obviously I'm still looking through. So, union membership was very important to all of these organizations, no matter how small. They would always hire, as far as I can tell, a union musician to be the band leader. So it makes it helpful because now we have union directories, right? So almost no matter how obscure they seem, I can look in the directory for that year and find them and what instrument they played, where they lived, and so on, and sort of corroborate some of that information. Um, the other thing is, like I said, they just across these dozens or 100 cases or whatever, they would typically hire somebody from their hometown or home region at least. So that's for the landsmanschaftn. For other types of things, charitable societies or the sort of trades-based mutual aid societies, they didn't necessarily have a regional preference. In terms of the reason for hiring somebody from their region, aside from it just being somebody they know or related to, or that they knew from back in Europe and so on. I'm guessing there's some musical aspect, but it's very, in terms of the YIVO anniversary journals, it's very limited information about what musical reason there might be for hiring somebody from their hometown. So almost always the musical program is just American music, foxtrots, like I said. But sometimes there would be something that would say, reminiscences of Lodge or whatever place in Europe. So once in a while, there's some sort of thing in the program that does reference their hometown, but that's in only in a handful of cases. And then, so it's really hard to say. And then by the 1960s, this sort of huge banquet with orchestras definitely seems to become less and less of a thing. And the size of the landsmanshaftn sort of declined and their importance to the social life and so on. So, you do see musical evenings later in the 1960s, even the 70s and 80s, but it's often an accordionist and a singer or some kind of novelty thing, sometimes an orchestra, but not as often. And it's hard to say any kind of pattern in the later years. It seems to be could be a member sometimes, or it could just be a random accordionist that they hire. I don't think there's as much of a pattern in the later years. So that's basically the end of it. Open to any questions now.
Wonderful talk. Thanks so much for sharing your research. We've got a bunch of questions, and I just want to take a moment to encourage anyone out there in the audience that has a question to make sure to jot it down in the chat. Um, one just kind of general question about Landsmannschaften, um, which, to what you were saying, Evo initiated a project in 1978 to collect these Landsmannschaften as they saw that a lot of them were closing down, in tandem with, the drop in immigration, as the shifting tides of history that everyone I'm sure knows about. But nevertheless, one viewer points out these are kind of amazing and important communal organizations. And so, do you have a sense of why they started winding down, as you just noted?
Yeah, there's even in the materials, there's a lot of letters back and forth that give you pretty good ideas. So people would be writing from Florida and sort of try to negotiate getting rid of their burial plot or something and saying, I'm not able to come to meetings because I live in Pennsylvania now. Or so there's the geographic thing of just people later in life moving to somewhere else or their kids moving away, and it becomes less relevant in that sense. And then it wasn't mentioned specifically, but this sort of social safety net aspect, I'm sure, is plays into it. So in the early years, especially, there's nobody's going to protect you living in the Lower East Side, in 1905, something bad happens to you. So it was definitely sort of banding together. And so if it's now 1965, something bad happens to you, there's much more of an apparatus in the country, I think, to save yourself. You don't necessarily need to band together with people in the same way. So at that point, I feel like it became more of a burial society or maybe a social, like a sort of old timer social club, that type of thing. But there's so many of them that were different sizes and different dynamics. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. There's a lot of questions about specific things. I'm going to keep the questions a little bit more general and then loop back to the specific. Um, Michael Alpert is viewing and has a few questions. Noted musician. Um, Michael asks, Dan, do you have a sense of whether the title professor was used more for klezmorim with formal musical training, or is this a term just kind of used interchangeably, or is it hard to know?
Um, I don't think it's anything to do with like a proper training because they pretty much all used it in, especially in the newspaper advertisements. It's pretty much every single time there's a person's name that says professor, and just looking into maybe who they were, you realize, oh, this person is the son of a tailor, and this person is from a klezmer dynasty, seventh generation, whatever, and they're both professor such and such. So, and I feel like it sort of gets into this kind of vaudeville and magician, such and such, like late 19th century, expert men who doesn't necessarily have any university training. They're just, yeah, professor. So I don't know beyond that.
One viewer is asking about the pay scale of these kind of gigs. Do you know anything about that? And this same viewer posits that perhaps going with local musicians, in addition to, or maybe instead of the supposition that you put forward about musical regionality, could have been about trying to find, work with people they know just in general, and or trying to get a good price from people they know, says
Mm.
this viewer.
Yeah, so I mean there is like a union price for any type of event. So there's an explicit price, but even back then, which NYU has some of those in their labor archive basically. So it says if you're playing this type of event, this is what you're supposed to charge. But then on the side of the YIVO archival materials, it would be in the ledger, so the organizational ledger for that month. They're writing down everything that there was the expenses, and then it may say, renting Beethoven Hall X amount of money, and then musician X amount of money. And I'm not, I mean, I took photos of some of those, but I don't know enough about the value of in different decades, how much a dollar is worth to say, oh, to have a good idea. That was sort of something I came across, but I didn't necessarily understand. But yeah, I agree that I'm sure it's having somebody who's the son of the vice president playing is probably you can strike a better deal than um, a celebrity who's on the radio or something. Yeah.
Hmm, fascinating. Another question for Michael Alpert. Um, did you look only at landsmanshaftn in New York, or were comparable organizations in Philadelphia or elsewhere part of the scope of your research?
In this, I was only purposefully looking at ones from New York, although Evo has some from the other cities. And so if I came across them, I did look at them, and they don't form part of my study per se, but they're interesting, and they have the sort of the same format of the anniversary journals, but from a different city. So it's interesting in that sense. But it's not a part of my project here. Yeah. And having lived in Montreal, there was a couple from Montreal that were of a special interest to me, just seeing the names of restaurants and old time things, from the 1940s or whatever. It's pretty cool.
Fascinating. So another viewer talks about their own family who were amateur musicians and is wondering if it was all professionals that you saw in these journals, or if there were also amateurs. And you did mention that everyone was, pretty much always a member of the union. But is that something that you have something to comment about?
I would say if they're hired as the band leader, they're probably a professional, quote unquote. They're a union member and they're already somehow established, even if they're playing pretty small time stuff. It's not, I don't think I would call them amateurs. If there's sort of the literary evening banquet with comedians and different members doing their shtick, yeah, probably some kind of semi-amateur thing. But I didn't see a ton of that because it's often just mentioning the band leader for a particular year. So it's hard to say. Yeah.
Another viewer is asking about communal aid organizations that were not Yiddish oriented. Wondering, for example, if there were Hungarian groups or other, that might be outside the scope of your research, but do you have anything to share about that?
Yeah, there's a couple. I mean, just as somebody who also loves Hungarian stuff, I sort of raised an eyebrow at the few that I found. So New York Public Library had one or two Hungarian language quote unquote landsmanshaft things, like I think from Transylvania or somewhere. And so the instead of being in English and Yiddish, they would be in English and Hungarian. And aside from that, they seem to follow the same format. So my feeling is that the Yiddish ones sort of they were the majority and they sort of set the norm. And then sometimes people from a different background would sort of follow that pattern and say, oh yeah, we're going to make one for Hungarians. And then Evo has a lot of this Maramarsher Young Men's Society, which is, I think, partly in the Hungarian speaking, partly the Yiddish speaking world of things. So um, those are the main ones. Can't say I found, for example, Russian language ones or anything aside from Yiddish and a little bit of Hungarian and German, I suppose. For especially the Galician and Bukovina ones, there might be some German, but yeah.
Um, Another question from Michael about Montreal. Did you find any indications of who the musicians were that were hired in MTL events?
No, I don't think so, which I was interested to find out, but those were some of the ones where they didn't name any musicians, they didn't even list any in the advertisement, so unfortunately not.
We have a bunch of questions, and I'm also very curious about the repertoire that were played, and also the instrumentation of the bands. Is this, you mentioned that often they refer to a band leader. Did they ever refer to the instrumentation that people can expect? And can you tell us a little bit more about the repertoire? You said it was foxtrots and waltzes and other kind of American or pan-European dance forms. Is this side by side with so-called klezmer music? Is it more kind of dance tunes, or is it the balance change? What else can you tell us about the repertoire and also the instrumentation?
So the instrumentation is never mentioned unless it's a soloist. So all of the ones where I said, "Oh, this is a cornet player or violinist," it's because I looked in the union directory. So that's that. There's definitely not an explanation of what the sort of in the banquet what the orchestra is made up of. It's just never mentioned. Um, in as I've kind of mentioned in the newspaper advertisements, they would say if it's a brass band or double brass band. So if we're looking at the 1910s and 1920s, that was sort of the turn of phrase that they used. So I don't know, that's something else as well, but it doesn't come up in the anniversary materials. What was the other thing? So when they're talking about hiring them, they also never mention anything about it. They just say, "Oh, we've hired for the upcoming banquet. We've hired Dave Terrace and at some maybe like a 10-man band or something." They might say, but yeah, they're not talking about a string quartet or whatever, unfortunately. And then in terms of the repertoire, it's really hard to say because only a subset have the program. Um, and then those are almost always sort of just a list of current American foxtrots, like I said, with titles and the composer, or they might throw in some Yiddish theater stuff. They might say medley of Alexander Olshanetsky theater pieces, things like that. Um, there's My feeling is that they probably was sort of a prestige thing around it, putting out sort of being a modern, like Americanized organization, and that there was some other aspect that wasn't printed. So sort of a Jewish dance set or something.
Mhm.
But definitely not like here's Bulgar number one and Fairlix number two and so on. Like they never ever printed that. At most they reference Yiddish theater or sort of um they would say like echoes of Kishinev or something like some kind of vague name that's like referencing back home, but it doesn't say what it is. Um, or they would have a solo violinist playing sort of a Jewishy like classical piece from that time or something. Yeah.
So you're saying that from the advertisements, you're inferring that they have a lower prestige value for klezmer music as compared to American dance music or Yiddish theater music. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, to me, the fact that they're printing like a such and such society orchestra and foxtrots, it just makes it look proper, and that maybe you don't need to mention that they're playing like dances from the hometown as well. Maybe it's just assumed. So it's not, I don't know if it's that part is not prestigious. Maybe it's just such a given that you don't even have to mention it. But I can't see that if they're almost always hiring somebody from their hometown, that there's no local flavor at all. Like, I gotta feel there's something, especially knowing like the few examples that we know, Abe Katzman playing Keshenev music and playing for the organization. And then if you listen to his recording, it's just like extremely Bessarabian klezmer. And then if you look at his program, it's foxtrots from 1925, Yeah, there's some kind of gap that we don't know about. Yeah.
Potentially a gap between what they recorded and what they played at these events, or a missing part in the record of what happened at the events themselves.
Yeah.
And on that note, another viewer is asking about corresponding recordings of these musicians. So you mentioned that a lot of these folks were, celebrities who were recording for radio in 78s. And For the other musicians, were there other sources that you looked to outside of the landsmanshaftn records to help fill in details, or are they hard to find information about?
In terms of their music or their biography.
Anything.
So in terms of their music career, I would say it's these old newspaper databases. So JPress is the one for um, Yiddish language stuff and some English language, and then there's a great one called Fulton Old Fulton Postcards. It's like just one guy's website where he archives like many old newspapers from New York. So that one, almost anytime I search the name of an old klezmer, there's some kind of thing saying, oh, they're going to play at this event, in upstate New York, or they're involved in a shooting, some kind of crime thing, just so you can if you have the name and then look it up in these old newspaper databases, you can find interesting tidbits, but it's always a bit incomplete or and so on. So just because I have so many names, there's many that I haven't even looked up yet, and I'm sure if I do, I'll find out, oh wow, their son was involved in a crime, or what, wow, they moved on to this new phase where they were playing, Carnegie Hall, or who knows, it's just all kinds of different life trajectories. And then, yeah,
Fascinating. So the press is an important other resource for this kind of research. Um,
yeah.
I'm wondering, maybe just jumping off of the things that you saw in the press, other than radio recording, 78s recording, and then also the kind of the banquet hall events and dance hall events that you saw in the Landsmannschaft, and what other kinds of contexts are you finding these musicians performing?
Well, it truly varies. Like, so some of them were in the sort of hotel orchestra thing, so they're probably playing American music most weekends just in a hotel for the guests, and then they're sort of moonlighting as a playing for their sort of hyper specific Jewish community. Um, Others, if you look up their name in the census, it says music teacher or theater musician, things like that. So, you start to get an idea that yeah, they may be mainly doing some other thing, but I don't necessarily have like a very complete picture of what they're doing. And yeah, and then in terms of like descendants, sometimes I've managed to connect, not as a result of this project yet because it's quite recent, but in terms of other klezmer people, I found their great grandnieces or different people who maybe know some things about them, but they don't, nobody was alive at that time, so they probably don't know very much. But I'm kind of hoping to try to figure out some people who are descendants and try to write to them and say, oh, do you know anything about this person? Do you have a photo of them? Amazingly old music from them, but probably not, things like that. So, yeah.
I'm sure that could turn up some really amazing some amazing things, and we'll have to have you back when you've done that. So keep us posted. Just a comment from Michael Alpert, which is very relevant to what we were just discussing. The repertoire listings and omissions are exactly consonant with most of the notebooks of klezmorim, in which non-Jewish origin repertoire was written down and the traditional klezmer repertoire wasn't, since it was A, known, and B, traditionally passed on by ear. So this is from Michael Alpert in the chat, suggesting that what Dan was saying about uh, listing the American repertoire, but not listing, but still performing potentially Jewish origin repertoire is kind of consonant with what was written down in Klezmorim notebooks. So it's fascinating. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, that makes sense.
One viewer is asking about a very specific musician. Did you encounter someone named M. Karlinski?
Yeah, I did. But I recognize the name and I probably noted it down, but I can't say much beyond that. It's just one of the many kind of, as far as I know, small time people who played a few, but I definitely recognize the name Karlinski. So feel free to reach out to me, this person, and I can see what I found. Yeah.
Okay, great. So just the final question. Oh, this viewer says I have a manuscript tune book from M. Karlinski. All right, so there's
Interesting.
a shidduch to be made. Please get in touch with Dan. Um, So I'm just curious where you see this research taking you next, and maybe if you could speak a little bit about how it fits into the other research you've been doing.
Yeah, I definitely hope to sort of come up with a bigger project about klezmer families and how they arrived in New York, where they came from, be it a book or I don't know something else. It's hard to say, but I'm definitely collecting information to try to write more about specifically the klezmer people and whatever, however you may define that, and trying to sort of uncover some that are mainly forgotten now and sort of figure out what differentiated them from the ones that we still remember and things like that. What's the other part of the question?
Just how this fits into the other work you've been doing, your past research.
Mm, yeah, in a way it does and doesn't. So with the copyright, the klezmer copyright Library of Congress stuff that I've been doing for the last few years, it doesn't particularly correspond. It seems to me, so that was very much like an offshoot of the recording industry. When people were planning to go and record a klezmer dance, they would write it down and send the copyright. So that really corresponds with the small subset of sort of celebrity people, quote unquote. Um, so anybody who is like these small time landsmanshaft musicians, they weren't copywriting things. Um, they probably had no reason to. They can play it. They're not planning to record it and protect their profits or anything. So um, yeah, in that way, it doesn't, even though it's the same time and place, it sort of comes at a different set of people, aside from the overlap of a handful of these people. In terms of the European klezmer stuff, like with the Klezmer Institute, it's also it doesn't exactly correspond, but it definitely I feel now that I understand more about sort of the late 19th century European klezmer world of the things that come up in Kisselhoff's like manuscripts or recordings that he collected, and then to imagine if somebody came from Ukraine to New York, what was the where were they coming from and what were they bringing over, things like that. But in terms of the same people, I can't say that there's, somebody who Kisselhoff recorded who then turns up here. No, it's definitely different set of people. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of conceptual overlap and like musical overlap in terms of what klezmers did and what professional musicians did in that time in general and things like that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Dan, thank you so much for sharing your research with us, and we look forward to following where it takes you.
Yeah. Thanks so much.